Hello, welcome to the Vino Marbioso on WOWDLP, Tacoma Park 94.3. I'm your host, Matt Hook, sharing R&B and jazz music from around the world. Today we have a very special show for me because we're looking a little bit into one of my favorite cities in the United States, the soul scene of Cleveland, Ohio, with Carlo Wolff. Carlo Wolff is a Cleveland author with a long career writing for publications like the Cleveland Plain Dealer, Goldmine, and Billboard. He's here to talk about his most recent book, Invisible Soul, uncovering Cleveland's underground soul scene. The book collects countless interviews from bands talking about the local venues that made the city's vibrant scene possible, collecting stories about everything from groups that hit it big, like the OJs or the Daz Band, to groups that never got known outside of Ohio, like the Hesitations. I think Carlo in this book accomplishes what I think should be the highest aim of journalism, to make sure a vibrant story that could easily get lost to time doesn't get forgotten, and archiving the voices of countless people before they pass on. So thank you so much for writing this book, Carlo.
It was a pleasure to write it and finally produce it last year. It
Well,
took I was sort of working on and off for a dozen years. It took a long time to marinate.
great. And to get things started, let's listen to The Hesitations with Soul Superman. This song features one of the main characters of the book, Art Blakey.
I can climb the highest mountain. I can swim the seven seas. I can swing through the jungle, baby, with the greatest of ease. But you know that I haven't found a woman yet that can drop me to my knees. 'Cause Superman, baby, Superman, baby, Superman, baby. He got soul, baby. I got soul, Superman. Now listen, like Batman and Robin, I never go wrong. Never go wrong. And I never found a woman that can bring me down. Bring me down. Because Superman, baby. Superman, baby. Superman, baby. Have no fear. Superman is here. Yeah, baby. Now listen, like the green hornet, I'm busy as a bee. You know that you in CLE will never have nothing on me, because I'm a combination of a Romeo and Hercules. And I haven't found a woman yet that can drop me to my knees, because Superman, baby. Take me, baby, yeah, in a pair of continental leotards and a pair of combat boots. I'm out of sight, faster than the speed of light, baby. Everything's gonna be alright, alright, baby. Have no fear.
You just heard Soul Superman by Cleveland group The Hesitations. Blakey is one of the main characters of Carlo Wolff's book, Invisible Soul. I'm joined here with Carlo Wolff today. He's going to talk a little bit about the book and the writing process and some of the artists featured inside of it. So first of all, I want to just ask about the origin of the book. From my understanding, this all started with a Facebook page that you ran where people would share memories of these old concerts and old venues, right?
Yeah, it was I have a Facebook page called Invisible Soul that obviously predated the book, and it consists primarily of display ads, from vintage display ads from the city's black newspaper, the Call and Post. I mean, in its ads, the Call and Post basically, in effect, wrote the history of a scene that had vanished and really had no other kind of record. It was fascinating, and it spoke to another world, a vanished world that I felt deserved coverage.
Because what interested you about soul music in particular? I know you've written a couple books in the past about the history of rock music in Cleveland. What's it at about soul?
Well, I can only answer that indirectly. In 2006, I published a book called Cleveland Rock and Roll Memories, which has done pretty well over the years, and it was a uh, a a collection of people's memories, not my memories. I came to Cleveland in '86, so I was my own rock experiences elsewhere. Anyhow, uh, the book came out. It got a lot of media. It did well, but throughout it, I always had the kind of nagging feeling that there was another story to be told. In other words, Cleveland Rock and Roll Memories was mainstream and largely white. So and that bothered me. It felt incomplete. So with Invisible Soul, I wanted to expose a scene that had been buried basically because that's how the culture is. The book Invisible Soul is sort of inescapably about race and the influence that has on popular culture.
Especially because Cleveland's a majority black city. Must have just
Right.
felt weird writing that rock book and realizing, wait a minute, in a city that's, I don't know what the demographics are back then, but in the current day is 60% black, to write a book about the music scene there and not have many black artists must have just felt odd.
Right. It was not intentional, but the circuits, I mean, when you do a book like this, because both Invisible Soul and Cleveland Rock and Roll Memories are based on interviews with lots of people. There were 130 in Rock and Roll Memories, and in Invisible Soul, about 70. And inevitably, when you do that kind of research, it's viral. One thing leads to another. One connection leads to another connection, and all of a sudden you have a network that you're writing about. Uh, it was fascinating. It was really revealing to me about how this city works. I love Cleveland. It's a vibrant, problematic city, like big cities in the U.S. are. And Invisible Soul is a celebration of people who should have made it in some ways.
Yeah, and I think that's really one of the things I just found so beautiful about this book, especially because you have so many interesting little stories that, it's records that are lost. It's bands that that do not exist on the internet. I mean, one of my
Right.
favorite things you mentioned in here is this little mini trend of black soul Beatles parody groups almost. Like Art Blakey had a group called the Wigs that would
Right.
dress up in
Right.
Beatles attire. And then George Hendricks, another singer featured in this book, had a similar group that would cover Beatles songs in an R&B style. I mean, and when I tried to find recordings of those bands, they did not exist.
Yeah, you find them in record meets. I mean, there are still places you can buy old vinyl in Cleveland, and you may not be able to find the music, but you can probably spend hundreds of dollars to get a beat up copy of the 45, which I didn't do.
And it's just really cool too, I think, with the Beatles parody groups because it shows, even though the country is hyper segregated, there was a lot of interaction between like the world of white music and the world of black music. And you talk a little
Right.
bit about that in the book itself with venues like Leo's Casino.
Sure. There was crossover, there were black and tan clubs. I mean, it's not as if there were no connections. There were. In fact, the Whigs, the Whigs were promoted by a white Jewish guy, and Don Gregory and the Montclairs recorded for a label started by major white figures in Cleveland's music business, Carl Maduri and Mike Belkin. So there were connections. It's just that there wasn't a lot of promotion. And what I found after interviewing scores of people for Invisible Soul is that there was no champion. There was no scene. There was a sort of de facto entertainment district on Cleveland's east side, but there was no central meeting point. You'll find these days that when vintage Cleveland soul is discussed, people fixate on Leo's Casino, which was a meeting point, a racial meeting point, and a place where bands could hone their craft. And it's where Motown road tested its acts. But it wasn't a recording studio like Way Out or Saru or a label. So it was about consumption of the culture, not creating it. I
And
could go on.
and and the closest place you mentioned this a lot in the book, closest place Cleveland did have to that central hub, I believe, is Bodie Recording Studio.
Right.
They never really had the money to really go national the way Motown did.
Well, they weren't a label. They weren't a brand. That's the weird thing about them. They were a huge production facility, and it was farm to table, from bringing your melody in to recording it to pressing it to, but it didn't promote, it didn't distribute, and there was no, like I say, no brand. It's a fascinating story. The sign is still up there on Union Avenue, and Mrs. Bodie still lives in the house she and her husband put together. It's amazing. And it's become a landmark now, a city landmark, which it should be. It's a great story on its own. Somebody should write a book about Bodie on its own. Numero Group came close in its 3 CD set, which came out in 2011, I believe. It's 3 CDs of tracks recorded at Bodie with really good history presented by Numero, the Chicago archival label. I'm sure you know.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that that was a great compilation of records they put out. And outside of things like Numero, a lot of these 45s and albums are also preserved by record collectors in the United Kingdom, right? In the Northern Soul scene up there.
Absolutely. Yes. And Japan, in Japan. Yeah, collectors will keep this music going. And there are DJs who play it. There are DJs who play it around here because the music itself doesn't date.
There's been a little bit of a revival of soul music among young people as well. And you saw that with like Sharon Jones and other groups.
Right. That's true. That's true. People want the authenticity of soul. It was about real things, whether it was social protest or intimacy. Soul addressed it. I mean, you can hear it. It could be idealistic. It could be gritty. It could be uh, challenging. But soul music it speaks to, it moves people, and it gets them moving.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. One of the people you mentioned in this book, I believe it's Art, I believe it's Art
Who?
Blakey, where his current band, the Day Knights, it's,
Right.
it's an all white backing band. And then in this book, you have so many black musicians who talk about that they wouldn't be able to play on the West Side just
Right.
because of their race, or that if they were a black band, it'd be impossible to get a gig on the West Side unless they had three or four, white backing musicians, or it'd be impossible to be, most white bands, if you're lucky, would have one black musician on it. So
Right.
now, looking at current pictures of our Blakey's group, I'm like, oh my God, he's just backed by a bunch of 30-year-old white guys who are like, what, a third of his age?
Well, they're 30 to 50. Since some of them are veterans of rock bands around here, and the band is really good. I mean, it's a tribute to Blakey that at 83, he can rock the house. He hasn't lost his voice. He's a powerhouse. That's why they call him Soul Superman. He's finally grown into the brand he wanted to spread way back 50 years ago. It's weird.
Yeah. And it's incredible how this music's connected with like a generation of people who, you know, come from a different race and culture, come from a different generation, and yet find these old 45s and are just like, it touches them, even though it's from, totally
Yep.
different social context.
Right, right. I agree. It's neat to see. It's neat to see. I'm glad the music lives on. I'm glad to contribute to that. I'd like to do more. In the book, there are a couple places where we suggest people contact us if they have related stories or if they have stories from that period, and we might include them in future editions. I'd like the book to be something live. I'd like it to keep expanding.
Yeah, and just a reminder for our listeners, if you're just tuning in, Matt Hook, you're listening to Divina Maravillosa on WOWD-LP Tacoma Park, talking to Cleveland author Carlo Wolff about his book Invisible Soul, Phenomenal History of the Cleveland Soul Scene. Now, to give readers a little bit more context of Cleveland Soul, I wanted to play a song by Harvey and the Phenomenals. Darlene, this is off Booting Recording Company, Cleveland, Ohio, a compilation of records from the small record, recording studio might be the best way to frame them, because as we talked about earlier, they're not really a label.
Right.
Cleveland, Ohio. That really helped, be a landmark for a lot of these soul musicians.
Right. And I think I knew Harvey. He died before the book was out, and I'm really sorry for that. He was a real help, a very good guitarist. I think Soul and Sunshine, the track he recorded at Bodie, is one of the best pieces of funk I've ever heard. I mean, you should check it out. I'm sure. Have you heard that, Matt?
I haven't heard that one. I'll have to throw that in later in the broadcast then.
Oh, it's stunning. I called it the best track Average White Band never made.
song you just heard was Darlene by Harvey and the Phenomenals. We're currently talking to Carlo Wolff, an author of a great book, Invisible Soul, a history of the Cleveland soul scene, where he talks about the important musicians and venues that created the vibrant Cleveland soul scene of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even stretching into today. Bodie Recording Company, the place where that record by Harvey and the Phenomenals was made, is one of the main almost characters of this book because so many bands and musicians recorded there and they just left us behind just a treasure trove of really phenomenal music. Thank you so much for coming on, Carla.
It's been a pleasure, Matt. Really, I hope the word of Cleveland Soul spreads. I'm doing what I can, and you're really helping.
One of the things you talked about is that it's about that this book is about the bands that didn't make it big. But
Right.
there were some groups from Cleveland that did make it big, the OJs and the Dazz Band. But sometimes those groups, when they made it big, didn't necessarily end happily. I mean, I think your chapter on the Dazz Band illustrates that really well, where one of the members has a great quote where he says, "You're looking at the Grammy on the mantle in your house, and you can't pay to heat it."
Right.
And
Right.
tell me just a little bit about the relationship between those bands that made it big and the smaller groups that just stayed regional. Would the smaller groups, still interact with members of the OJs and the Dazz Band a lot, even though the OJs and the Dazz Band were having these nationally charting hits?
I don't know. I don't know what that relationship was. All I know is that there was everybody knew everybody else. After all, Cleveland is a small big city, let's say, and people interact and people share bills and people go from a small band to a bigger band, like Charles Hatcher became Edwin Starr out of the Future Tones, which was the first band in Cleveland with a self-contained rhythm section. It was a band that started doo-wop and ended R&B, for
Yeah,
example.
for
Um,
listeners who don't know Edwin Starr, he's most famous for his hit War, which is a classic Vietnam era protest song. But yeah, keep going, Carlo.
right, that's true. And he was also well known for 25 Miles and Agent Double O Soul, which is a very dated track because it's about James Bond, but it also rocks like crazy. Um, the OJs, I wish I'd interviewed them. They are a success story. They're a success story for sure, much more so than the Dazz Band, which is a fascinating story unto itself, and it is, I think, a classic example of things evolving and collapsing and coming together again under the name of musical differences. There's a guy in Cleveland today who was in and out of the Dazz Band who sort of lays claim to the name. There's a lot of internal battles over who owns the Dazz brand right now. And the story I tell about how they were frozen out of I think it was the Grammys after Let It Whip became a hit for Motown is just irritating. They should have been acknowledged. They're a good band.
Can you tell us a little bit more about why they got froze out of the Grammys? Was it just because of conflicts with the Motown business side?
I think so. I think the way I understand that situation is that they got into financial and managerial jams before those Grammys and may have been in shall we say, a transitional period between labels. Daz went from Motown to, I think, 20th Century Fox. So it as it declined commercially, its label power declined also. And I would think that, and this is speculation, I would think that Motown management um, maybe threw up both its hands at the gnarly internal dissension of the band. Like I said, much of that is speculation. It's a book that should be written. It would be a hard book to write because it's current. I don't think some of the enmity within that band ever went away.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple groups in here that almost feel like they could be their own books. I mean, one you mentioned earlier with the Daz band about, fights over who owns the actual name of the group. And that's also a theme in your chapter about Sly, Slick, and Wicked, which is a
Right,
group that worked with James Brown for a
right,
while.
right,
And now, they have and it's interesting because Sly, Slick, and Wicked, they had a couple, charts hits. They ended up doing Soul Train. They have the James Brown connection, but they
right.
weren't huge. But yet you still have people trying to copy their name and create their own groups to get wealthy off whatever image they still have left.
Right. I ended that section of the book with Sly, Slick, and Wicked because it was a success on its own terms, and I really like John Wilson. The guy's a pro. The guy is very warm, and the music is pretty good. It stands up. It stands up, and John sort of never got derailed, despite, I mean, the labels they recorded for got derailed or went out of business or somehow failed, but they didn't. So to me, uh, Sly, Slick, and Wicked is a success.
Yeah, I mean, it showcases that even with all the crazy business things and the difficulties of just getting their name out there, they're still able to create really great, impactful music.
Right,
And
right,
I think too, a book like this is especially important because of groups like Sly, Slick, and Wicked that, as you say, you're treating them like a success. I think it shows that a lot of times, I think in the music industry, we kind of view, oh, successful bands are groups that are huge, nationwide people who can go on these national tours and sell at stadiums. But this book, it paints a much different picture of success, where success can just be, a guy who's very popular in his local area and just makes a living doing club dates.
right, right. Well, Cleveland's funny that way. The another variation on that issue or theme is Michael Stanley, who is is still huge in Cleveland. I think 4 years after his death, there are tribute concerts, there are reunions of, do you know who he is?
Yeah, he's a very famous Cleveland rock musician.
Right,
I believe,
right.
like in Cleveland, he would sell out like arenas of more than 10,000 people. It was like he was Springsteen.
Yes, he holds the record at Blossom. It's like 5 nights sellouts, 18,000 a night. I mean, it's crazy. He was gigantic here. Really nice guy, really interesting to interview. There's a there's a long section about him in my Belkin book, in the Mike Belkin book that I wrote about 7 years ago. Um, but Michael Stanley raised the issue of success. Was he a success? Absolutely, in the region and in various other pockets of the country, but he, for again, largely because of record label politics, he didn't go nationwide, and he should have. He was talented.
Yeah, I mean, that's an ongoing theme in this book. I mean, and sometimes even when these groups would have connections with these national figures, there's one group in this book that the OJs end up starting a label in Cleveland and they sign some local artists, and then the label, dies within a year. And you'd think that, oh, getting to work with one of the biggest soul groups alive at the time would propel someone to fame, but a lot of times it doesn't.
Right,
Um,
right.
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know what the record industry is like now. It's unrecognizable to me. But at the time, I discussed during the period I discuss in this in Invisible Soul, it was tangible. Let me put it that way. It was even it was leaning toward the corporate, but it was still produced and managed and nurtured by humans.
And I think too, one of the sort of interesting parts, you said a lot of your research was done through looking through old call and post advertisements. Well, now a lot of print journalism doesn't exist. A lot of the sources that you used for this, that old call and post, the old plain dealer, articles, though there aren't reporters covering these hyper local scenes as much anymore. So I
Right.
wonder, like, are future generations even going to be able to really write something like this? Because, Facebook could go under any second, and we're not going to have archives of that the way we have archives of physical print publications.
You're right about that. You're right about that. What to do about it? I have no idea. I mean, say if Facebook tanked, something would come up to replace it. At the same time, in between those events, things would be lost for sure. How to present? If you come up with an answer, Matt, let me know.
Yeah. And it's interesting because because when you were looking at this book, when did you start the Facebook page and start your research thinking, I'm gonna write a book like this? Or did you just go into it thinking, I want to do an article and then it just evolved?
I wanted to do more than an article. It as I how do I put this? I the book work on the book originated with an interview with the Latter-day Hesitations in 2011. I write about it where I went to George Hendricks' basement and I and my daughter hung out while these guys rehearsed for a comeback, right? So it's in the winter of 2011. Lila and I are in George's basement, and George was wonderful. He was it was a it started as an assignment for a website on previewing the Hesitations as they came back in their comeback concert at the Beachland. The Beachland's a pretty well-known club in Cleveland. Uh, so it was to write a preview for this. As I talked to George there and later for the article, it dawned on me that there was more to the story, that there was a past to explore. So George, God love him, turned me on to a whole lot of people whom I went to their houses all over Cleveland's East Side in 2011 and 2012 with my MacBook and typed them up as they spoke to me about groups they were in. And I seriously regret that I didn't record them. That was really stupid. I will never do that again. But I talked to them and typed up the interviews and did about, like I say, 70 of these. They're listed in the back of the book uh, over the next 1.5 to 2 years. And as that accumulated, I began to realize I had something. Okay, something I wanted to work with because I'd been interested in that scene. I like soul music. I'd been interested in that scene since I was a young man. So I started realizing there was a story there, a story to be told, not just anecdotes, but a larger cultural and racial story. So by 13 or 14, I developed an outline. I developed a marketing plan. I tried to get it published locally at an academic press, and elsewhere at another academic press. They weren't interested. One press, the local ones, basically said, it'd be a lot better if you included Northern Soul, the British scene. And I thought to myself, yeah, sure, finance me, send me to London and have me live there for 5 years so I can soak it in. Didn't work for me. And the other academic press quarreled with my facts through it's a complicated situation, but at any rate, the bottom line was they turned it down. So I sort of stewed on it for quite a few years. I had these raw interviews, and then I hooked up with my publisher, Act Three Creative, for which I did the Belkin book and Ghost wrote 2 other books. One on Cleveland's first Black architect, whose name is Robert Madison. The book is called Designing Victory, and it's about breaking racial barriers primarily. Bob is 100 years old. He's still going. And the other one was about Terry Gilbert, a locally well-known super liberal lawyer who basically, I mean, for your listeners, they should know that he's the guy who was behind the elimination of Wahoo for the Cleveland Indians. Wahoo no longer represents the Cleveland Indians, who are now called the Cleveland Guardians. Terry Gilbert put that in motion. Anyhow, at the end of those books, Act Three said, and I've been talking to Act Three about Invisible Soul all the time I was there, and they said they want to publish it. And that's when the real writing began. So the writing, this book is a COVID production. The writing began for real in 21 and was over in 22. And that's when it was assembled. I mean, it's a complicated book. It has high technology. It has different sections. Do you think it works, Matt?
Yeah, I really do like how one of the special things about this book, Invisible Soul, is that there's a lot of links you can scan with your phone that will send you directly to, a YouTube of the song. And I think that really adds a lot because it lets you, because, it's a book about music. It's great to have the music that it's being talked about within the book kind of integrated into that.
Well, 30 years ago, if I'd written this book, it would have demanded a companion CD. And that's a whole other skill set that involves licensing and dealing with copyright. YouTube is licensed and copyrighted. It's like very fortuitous that we could use the QR technology to get you to the music that you're reading about. Yeah, I like that too. I mean, I never thought of that. Jim O'Hare, my writing partner, who's credited on the cover, thought of that, and God love him. That was a very smart move. I like that about it.
So next we're gonna take a listen to one of these Cleveland soul musicians with "Show Enough." It's a song featuring the great James Brown.
So you think you love him, girl, you know you love him. So you think you love him, wanna blow your mind, what you left behind. Oh, memory. Ooh, yeah, I've tried so hard to convey my love, but you only ignore me. Whoa, I felt we could make it, I really felt we could make it, girl, but you only thought of him, sure enough now. 10,000 tried. Yes, I really tried. And all I can say is, you really love him. Show up, you really love him. Show up, you really love him. Love him. Show up, love him. Show up, show up. Ooh, show up, you really love him. Show up, you really love him. Love him. Ooh, ooh, ooh.
Hey, Sly.
Yeah, Wicked.
Man, why did that girl do you like that?
I don't know.
Man, I've seen times where you worked 8 hard hours on the job.
Sure
And
did.
you didn't do nothing but bring your check home to her.
Hey man, maybe that was his rib. Or maybe she had a love Jones for the cat. I don't know. But you know, Slick had the same problem, didn't you, Slick?
Dig it. It even happened to me. Me of all people. Life is funny.
Yeah.
Love is funny. It can play stupid games on you. Still, I watch out for the tricky game. But nevertheless, I'm still a man. I know I am.
10,000 times I've tried. Lord knows I really tried. And all I can say is, you really love him. Show up, you really love him. Show up, you really love him. Love him. Show up, love him. Show up, show up. Ooh, show up, you really love him. Show up, you really love him. Love him.
You know, you're coming into this book and and you talk about this in your intro really well, where you're a white writer coming in to talk about a black music scene. How did you navigate that?
It wasn't easy. I mean, it's still not, but I navigated mainly through the work I did, through doing all those interviews. People got to know me and to trust me. And some of the people who figure in this book have seen it and expressed appreciation for it. I mean, it is weird and it's complicated, Matt. Over the last, it's very strange how race works and at the same time can be invisible. Just a quick anecdote. Yesterday, and this is sort of related, yesterday, I got a messenger message through Facebook from a guy I'd never heard of who asked me, a black guy who is affiliated with Antioch Baptist Church, which I'm sure is a black church, asked me whether I wanted to be part of a Zoom discussion about Origin, the movie of Isabel Wilkerson's Cast. Do you know that book?
Yeah.
You
I've
know
read
it?
that book.
Okay. Well, so this guy, so I said, how did you get onto me? Right? And he told me that he was looking up Cast on Wikipedia and he looked in the references list at the bottom. And I was cited for a Pittsburgh Post-Gazette review I did of that book 5 years ago. Right? And I'm thinking, oh my God, that's amazing. So he called me. He said he recognized my name because I've been a journalist in Cleveland for 35 years. So he's seen I've been bylined, you know? So I'm going to join that Zoom discussion. And it's funny how race is always around us, but doesn't always have to matter.
One of the big moments in this book is really the destruction of that East 105th Street Black Entertainment District. That's where most of these venues were that had Cleveland soul. These artists, that's where a lot of them would meet and hang out. They'd go to different hotels to stay at and then have jam sessions. It was literally like the architecture that let this scene exist. And now, if you go to Cleveland, that area doesn't exist anymore. It's just the Cleveland Clinic and part of the Case Western Reserve University campus. Can you talk a little bit more about the destruction of that arts district?
I wasn't here, but from talking to people, it was a combination of white flight. Well, it was a black district, so it wasn't white flight so much as it was redlining was involved. The Cleveland Clinic and Case asserted their dominance in that district and basically bulldozed it. One of the stories that remains to be written about that situation is the story of Winston Willis. I mentioned him very briefly in the book. He was a black entrepreneur who, rumor has it, is still alive, by the way. He developed around 105th to 90th along Euclid, a a kind of entertainment district. I think toward the end in the 80s, it got what was regarded as somewhat grimy and seamy. It was not put it this way, it was not a showcase district for the powers that be. And I suspect, and this is just from a brief reading of some old plain dealers, I suspect that the powers that be didn't want that kind of imagery to be the public face of Cleveland. Um, so yeah, the clinic and Case, to a lesser degree, sort of supplanted the district. Supplanted the district. There was also there were changes in the music too. I mean, there was more as it became more electric, there was less work for real humans. Music shrank over the years. You can go from all the way from Cab Calloway in the 30s with big bands to the biggest bands of the times I was talking about was probably the Daz Band, which at its height was 11 people. So there was less of a payroll. There was less work. There was less work. I don't know. Ask me some more questions about that.
Yeah, it's interesting where like the morphing from, big bands to rock bands, and now it's just DJs, or it's just one guy means that there's less work in the nightclub industry for people. Because
Now
one
it's
thing,
now it's sound files with speakers.
yeah, and especially too, because geographically, it seems like Cleveland Clinic and Case Western, because of the Winston Willis and that entertainment district bordered their properties.
Right.
It was where they wanted to expand because, it was right next to them.
Oh
So,
yeah,
yeah.
sure. It spread. I mean, the clinic is unstoppable. And its redemption is what it does. It's a great hospital. But that doesn't deny its empire building.
Where did all these musicians and clubs and club owners go when East 105 was destroyed? I mean, I imagine they all just didn't disappear. Did they all start performing more in the suburbs and just get more disparate? Did they all go to Cleveland Heights? Like, what happened to all these groups when this central hub died?
Well, the clubs went out of business too. They just dwindled. I can't think of a place right now except for the sporadic show at Beachland where to go to hear this music. You know, it's not a very vital scene anymore. Where did they go? They went into other kinds of work. I write about Harvey Hall. He did very well in Harvey and the Phenomenals, probably through the 70s. Okay, but then Yeah, the city shrank. There was less work. And the city is, all I've heard now is that the rate of shrinkage is decreasing. It's not over, but it's decreasing.
And in Cleveland, you might have a situation similar to Baltimore. That's where I live. It kind of has similar,
Right.
systematic problems where when you look at the numbers, the city is getting smaller, but simultaneously wealthier because you're kind of replacing working class families with young professionals.
Uh-huh.
And then as soon as those young professionals have kids, they move away.
Right. I don't know whether that's happening here. I'm not a demographer, but yeah, there are similarities between the two cities, and Baltimore produces its own soul music. It's pretty good, right?
I haven't dug too much into the history of the Baltimore soul scene. I mean, there's a very similar parallel between East 105th and Pennsylvania Avenue, which was it's now a historic arts district, but there's not any venues left. And that's where like artists like Billie Holiday and whatnot would start getting her start. And it's kind of a parallel thing where these, black arts districts that were pretty vibrant in these cities just ended up just falling apart after just a combination of a couple incidents. Because here too in this book, a lot of people talk about the Ho the
Huh.
Huff riots and the Glenville
Right.
shootout as a big cause for the decline in these neighborhoods too, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are stories in my book about uh, how the riots basically interrupted Leo's casino. It absolutely. You can still drive through parts of Cleveland and you see scars of that. Those were very, very bad. They were very destructive. To see Lou Ragland talks about them and Blakey talks about them, about how they made people scared to go downtown. I mean, I play ping pong. I was speaking to a guy the other day and saying how I just come from someplace downtown. He says, "Oh, I never go there. I never go there. I don't want to go there." I said, don't be scared of it. Try it. It's interesting. It's fun. There are a lot of places to go there. And that's an attitude here. Really is. I don't know whether that's true where you are.
Oh, it's definitely true in Baltimore. I don't know if it's the same in DC area, but definitely in Baltimore, there's that attitude of, and a lot of it's just racism because Baltimore's a majority black city surrounded by white suburbs. But
Right.
and and here in this book, it's interesting. I mean, you talk about at one point one of the more interesting things, and one of the things I really like about this book is how much you really focus on the ancillary businesses that evolve around a music scene, like the clubs, the promoters, the record labels. But Chuck Abner, who
Yes.
was basically the semi-official tailor for the Cleveland soul scene, it sounds like. And his business, started out in Glenville, and then after the riots, he just moved it to Cleveland Heights.
Sure, sure. I wouldn't say he was the official tailor. In some ways, Barbara White was. I mentioned her as the head of a fan club in there. She dressed George Hendricks, but she wasn't a business. She was a single person. Okay, she managed Harvey Hall and the Phenomenals. But Chuck, the reason I used him is he's what I think of as a kind of bridge guy. He was a link between the races, for one thing, and and between cultures. And there were people like that. There were people like that. That goes for white bands who hire black facilitators too.
Yeah,
All I'm saying is Chuck, I really like Chuck. He was very candid, you know.
and
And
he
I
was
went to when we moved here, I remember going to a store, I think I mentioned it, called Man Talk in Cleveland Heights, and it was like a kind of wild, funky clothing store, even in the late 80s. Yeah, he had taste.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where he talks about like growing up in Glenville and just, the vibrant African American community on like East 105th, how popular it was. But I mean, it's interesting because his account of the Glenville, the riots and everything, he talks a lot about how a lot of the cops were more interested in just brutalizing black people than protecting his business.
Right.
Like, and there's some quotes from cops that unfortunately I cannot repeat on air where the cops are just talking about wanting to just shoot the black protesters outside of his store. And then Abner's like, these are my customers. Stop this.
Right.
Like,
Right.
mm,
The guy was fearless until the riots basically killed his market. So yeah, the riots were seriously detrimental to Cleveland.
yeah. One of the other main characters in this book is Lou Ragland,
Yep.
the guitarist. Can you talk a little bit about him and his importance to the scene?
Yeah, he is the guy I came to really admire in some ways. He was a multi-instrumentalist. I think he started on tuba of all things, and he was like a acquisitive, hustling kid who was an engine. He felt like a force of nature. I got to know him pretty well uh, just before he died. He died in August 2020, and he was road manager for the OJs. He was business manager for the OJs. He was a sometime OJ. He got around. He owned the Ink Spots, which is a prehistoric doo-wop group from the 40s. He claimed to own that brand, and he had virtually a Las Vegas residency. What a weird place to end up for a soul singer from Cleveland, right? He was a really nice guy, good writer. There's a numero. Do you know the numero box?
Yeah, he has an entire box of his recordings, right? When he was with groups like,
It was 3 CDs, and it's really good. I like it a lot. I mean, you should play a Travel Alone or Good for the Gander. I talk about that. One of my favorite stories about Lou is about his band Hot Chocolate ceding ground to a British band of the same name in a name dispute. Who owned that name? It's in the book. Lou basically lost, but did so with class. And the Hot Chocolate album, I would love to get a copy of that. Lou gave me a copy of the 45, Good for the Gander,
mm,
and it is great. It is great. He was the way I read his life, he was a guy who could sort of step into any role in a musical situation and perform.
yeah,
Not
I
that
mean,
he was a one-man band. He liked performing with other people and having his own groups, but uh, he could just play virtually anything and fill in if needed. So he was a utility guy aside from being a creator. He played, he had a couple reunion shows in the like 13, 14, maybe 16 in Cleveland where people who used to play with him performed with him. Uh, and he was really good. He was a very good player. I liked him a lot. He had a ferocious work ethic. and he was a purposeful guy. Purposeful guy.
1, 2, 3, 4.
I mean, it's
What else can I
incredible
tell you
history.
about him? I mean, he was also helpful. There's an anecdote about his encouraging Eugene Ross to join his band. When Ross came across him trying to fit some equipment into his car. Very personal, good anecdotes. I liked Lou. Lou was toward the end. He and I were talking about me helping him write his biography, but then he died. He would have been a good book.
So one thing Lou talks about too is how Cleveland was just in the shadow of Motown, and that was one of the things that kept the Cleveland scene obscure. Because Detroit's so close by. It's not like
Right.
Philadelphia International where there's a little bit more distance, and if you're in Philadelphia, it's probably easier to connect with people in DC and New York. And he talks a bit about, and he claims a little bit it's just because of the old-fashioned payola system too, where Motown had more money to promote records on radio,
Oh,
things
oh
like
yeah.
that.
But they also had Berry Gordy. I mean, there was no Berry Gordy in Cleveland. Goes back to what I said a long time ago. There was no advocate, no champion. There was no recognition of a scene to promote.
And it's
So groups would go sort of flail their way up to Detroit and try to get into the Motown door. There's one story I have here about True Movement. I'm trying to find it. It was the one thing I regret about the book is that I wish I had an index. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, True Movement. It's on page 41. And basically, True Movement was being scouted out by Motown. So their manager ended up, uh, who managed other groups and artists, uh, ended up going to Motown and demanding that Motown sign his whole roster. And Motown said no. So I have this, my last paragraph about that is, for a minute, True Movement looked to be on a fast track to the big time, but tough business dealings slammed the brakes on their dream. True Movement lost so much face it disbanded. You can sense his eyes rolling behind his shades as Coghill, who was the singer, it was Phil Coghill relives the story. I mean, that's a classic story of overreach.
Where they're the Motown's the ones that holds our cards. You can't play hardball with them. And a lot of
Sure,
Cleveland groups try to do that. And
right.
that and then also it sounds like because there was no central person in charge of everything, the way there was, Motown in Detroit or Philadelphia International in Philly, there was no trademark. This is what Cleveland soul sounds like. I know that's what Lou Ragland
Correct.
talks about, where he says we don't have a Cleveland sound. In Philadelphia, you got the sound of Philadelphia. You have the Motown sound. It's marketing and style.
Right. I mean, there are people who would disagree with me, who think there is a Cleveland sound. There have been postings about that on Facebook occasionally. But and there that's not to say there's no distinctive Cleveland soul music. I mean, I wouldn't be writing about this if there wasn't. But the lack of a central advocate is startling. Gordy had not only artists, he had infrastructure. What I mean by that is he had an operation that could back any individual artist he wanted to promote. Like the Funk Brothers and various girl groups he had, like the Marvelettes, who could be background singers, uncredited. behind other people. You didn't have that kind of interchangeability in Cleveland. You had a lot, you largely had individual artists who wanted to make it on their own, but there was no machinery behind them.
Yeah,
That makes sense?
there was no here's the backing band for your records that you can
Right,
play with. It was you have to make your own band.
right, right,
Yeah, it
right.
sounds like Cleveland artists had to do a lot more just themselves.
Yes, I think so.
And do you think that kind of almost DIY attitude? I mean, some of the stories in this reminds me a little bit almost of the punk scene, where you have bring your own bottle sort of music venues that would just be at these semi-legal bars. Like, do you think that do
Yeah, yes,
do you think that
yes.
DIY aesthetic kind of created any kind of unique things about Cleveland soul music? You know, you obviously listen to so much of it putting together this book. Is there any sound or stylistic things that stuck out to you?
Rhythm was pretty important. I think there's a sort of jazzy feel to it, a kind of loose feel to it, and this is very general, Matt. Uh, that 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 distinguishes it at its best, and at its best, it can be also very tight. Like I mentioned, Soul and Sunshine. Be sure to listen to that today, okay? You won't be able to get it out of your head. There was a singer named Bobby Wade who was a really good balladeer. There's another element of Cleveland soul music is uh, a rich gospel flavor. You hear that in some of the Hesitations tunes. It's almost they gospelized Born Free and The Impossible Dream. Those were their big hits as the 60s were turning into the 70s. And those are vocal treatments of pretty sentimental piano songs, piano hits by a guy named Roger Williams. So there's sentimentality as an element of Cleveland soul music.
So where they almost take a lot of older songs in a way you wouldn't see in other more soul scenes.
Maybe, maybe there's a rich musical tradition in Cleveland that certainly goes beyond soul music. You hear it in the Cleveland Orchestra. And the more I meet people in the musical scene, the more I realize that many of them are classically trained. They're good. They're good musicians. Um, when you listen to some of the tunes that you can access through the QR codes in this book, they're very polished.
Yeah, like a lot of the musicianship is top notch, and as you said, um, there's a bit of, but there is a bit of a more looser feel. It doesn't sound as kind of tight as a
Discipline.
Motown track, and that's not, a negative thing. It's just different.
Right, right, right. It's not as, I mean, after a while, you listen to enough Motown stuff and there's a lot in common among the recordings.
Well, thank you so much, Carlo. We just really appreciate your time. Again, a reminder, I'm Davina Marbioso here. We're talking with Invisible Soul author Carlo Wolff on WOWDLP Kuma Park 94.3. Again, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great to talk about all these old R&B acts. And we're going to spend the rest of the broadcast listening to some of the songs and artists that Carlos just talked to us for about the last bit more than an hour.
Enjoy that. It's been great being on. You've made me think about what I did over and over again, but I'm glad it's out and I'm not thinking about how to get it out.
All right, thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you.